About 2.5 years ago, on February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded neighboring Ukraine. This invasion had been forecasted for a while, as Russian forces had at times surreptitiously, at times more overtly, supported separatist factions in the eastern and southeastern portions of Ukraine for about a decade, eventually invading and then annexing the Crimean Peninsula back in March of 2014, using what became known as the Little Green Men strategy because the invading soldiers had their flags, patches, and other insignia removed, which made them look like undifferentiated soldiers and gave the Russian government deniability, allowing them to say, basically, some patriotic members of our military might be inclined to help their fellow travelers in parts of Ukraine because those people are being repressed for their Russian heritage, and they crave freedom from their central government, which is run by Nazis. How these patriotic soldiers, acting on their own behalf, without support from the Russian government, supposedly, were able to bring so much heavy artillery and tanks with them was never formally addressed. So Russia had been chipping away at Ukraine for a long while, leading up to this more conventional attack in 2022, grabbing an important port when they took Crimea, and leaving the Ukrainian government, which had been tilting toward Europe and away from Russia's sphere of influence, which is part of what triggered that pseudo-invasion of Crimea. They left Ukraine fighting those separatist groups on their eastern flank pretty much continuously for the decade leading up to that bigger invasion a few years ago. When that invasion was launched, Russia was expected by pretty much everyone, including themselves, to basically waltz right into Kyiv with little opposition, as it was this huge, powerful country with nukes and a massive conventional military apparatus, so it stood to reason it should be able to easily defeat its weaker, former satellite, supplicant nation neighbor. But that's not how things played out. Ukraine managed to hold off an initial ill-planned but large invasion force, and for the past 2.5 years they have continued to hold those lines, despite huge drafts of soldiers and new investments in wartime materials, including drones and missiles that have been near continuously lobbed at Ukrainian military fortifications, but also cities and towns by the Russian government. For the past year or so, following some back-and-forth pushes by Russian and Ukrainian forces, in mostly the eastern part of Ukraine, at least following that initial unsuccessful incursion toward the capital, Ukraine's efforts to reclaim its captured territory have been fraught. It launched a successful counterattack a little while back, retaking some earlier captured territory, but after plowing through Russian forces and arriving in the eastern portion of the country, its next stage offensive attempts basically collapsed as soon as they were launched. The Ukrainian government is still making fresh attempts in this regard periodically, as any stagnation and seeming lack of progress could serve as justification by its allies to stop sending money and weapons to bolster their war effort, but these have been relatively small and have not accomplished much, not for the last year at least. The same was generally true for Russia up until just recently. Its troops on the ground, mostly exhausted and undersupplied, their pushes deeper into Ukraine met with stern enough resistance that they've had to pull back, or they've persisted in shouldering their way through a meat grinder defense, capturing tiny bits of territory, but with huge costs in terms of lives and hardware. This past year, they have seen some decent gains, though, as freshly drafted and trained troops have subbed in for exhausted and wounded Russian soldiers, and as Ukraine's forces have suffered the consequences of delayed support from many of their allies, but the US in particular, and as their own forces have been unable to tap out, rest and recover, because of the difference in the size of the two countries' populations, but also because of the nature of the conflict. Ukraine being invaded, while Russia has remained largely a safe haven for those who step back from the front lines. As of the day I'm recording this, in late August of 2024, Russia's military controls about 20% of Ukraine's total territory, and that includes Crimea and other chunks that were taken in 2014. Around 8.2 million of Ukraine's 41 million person population before the invasion had already fled the country by mid-2023, some having returned in the year or so since, but millions of people still scattered throughout Europe and the rest of the world, making this the continent's largest refugee crisis since World War II. About 8 million Ukrainians are now considered to be internally displaced, which means they are homeless within their own country, often because their cities or towns have been captured or destroyed. Estimates on casualties and fatalities in this conflict vary widely, as official numbers are often incomplete and filtered for public consumption and propaganda purposes. But some fairly strict and consequently probably low estimates from outside groups suggest a few 100,000 people may have died in this conflict so far, with hundreds of thousands more having been wounded, in some cases grievously, with some of the more biased figures, like those provided by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, suggesting that well over 500,000 people may have been wounded on Russia's side alone since the 2022 invasion began. Again, this war has been uneven, but surprising from the get-go. Russia taking a lot of territory, but Ukraine holding its own and performing well beyond almost everybody's expectations. But over the last year, since battle lines in the east were more firmly drawn and both sides had the opportunity to carve out defenses and lay mines, make tank traps, things like that, this has been a story of slow attritional conflict, which has tended to mean an advantage for Russia. They have ever so slowly been claiming more of Ukraine, grabbing just over 400 square miles of territory over the course of the past 12 months, which is a little over 1,000 square kilometers, including a few dozen cities and towns along those well-entrenched emplacements. What I'd like to talk about today is a recent move by Ukraine that has seemingly surprised just about everyone again, and which, depending on who you ask, is the desperate act of a flailing military or an inspired bit of asymmetrical warfare that could help turn the tides in their favor. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Learn more about Let's Know Things, subscribe to receive free email updates, and or become a supporter to receive monthly bonus episodes at letsknowthings.com. Part of why many well-informed analysts assumed Russia's invasion of Ukraine would be a quick thing, several days long, maybe a week or two at most, is that Russia's military is big and backed by the largest arsenal of nukes in the world. Russia's economy is also decently large, even if it is significantly dependent on fossil fuel and mineral wealth. So Russia's military should be capable of stomping into a smaller country's territory, especially a neighboring country, which is easy to get to, and then killing and threatening everyone into submission, and menacing them with nuclear weapons if they do anything threatening in return. That's the ostensible promise of having a nuclear arsenal. You have the whammy on everyone else if they do anything that really scares or threatens you, no matter what you do to them first. That expectation did not pan out, but the threat of nukes has hovered over this conflict from day one, and Russia's government has happily reinforced the sense that if Ukraine does anything to threaten them in return, even as they invade and gobble up Ukraine's territory, killing and kidnapping their people, Russia still might use nukes in return if Ukraine does anything they don't like, because why wouldn't they? And they've often signaled this by saying basically that if the fatherland is ever threatened, if anyone really truly menaces Russia in return for its menacing of them, that could serve as a spark that turns this invasion into a nuclear conflict. This threat has ensured Russia's invasion of Ukraine thus far has been a fairly one-sided undertaking, in which Russia can do basically anything they want, stomping all around Ukraine and launching endless drones and missiles at their densely populated cities, but Ukraine is not allowed to do anything like that to Russia in return, not on Russian territory. And this nuclear threat has been taken seriously enough by Ukraine's allies that they have said from the get-go, we will give you money and weapons, but you have to promise not to use them on targets within Russia, because we do not want to kick off a nuclear war or even a broader conflict between nuclear-armed nations. if Russia were to consider attacks by Ukrainians wielding American weapons against Russian civilian targets to be an attack by the US, which was always a theoretical possibility that, again, Russia was happy to reinforce. As a result, some of the weapons provided to Ukraine by its allies were artificially limited, including the 20 HIMARS long-range rocket systems the US supplied back in late 2022, which were altered before being sent so they could not be used against targets within Russian territory. The US and other allies have also been incredibly hesitant to provide Ukraine weapons with greater range, like ATMS, Army Tactical Missile System rockets, that can strike targets up to 186 miles away, and fighter jets that could be used to take out targets deep within Russian territory if used correctly. Some of those restrictions have been loosened a little bit in the past handful of months. From the beginning, though, Ukrainian forces have figured out ways to hit targets within Russia, generally using asymmetric methods like covert infiltrations and loose alliances with anti-government entities operating within Russia, rather than launching aerial or artillery strikes from within their own borders. In 2022, they struck dozens of air bases and fuel depots and similar targets across the border, though they almost always denied involvement officially, due to fears that overtly launching such attacks could lead to significant reprisals and could cause their allies to step back from supporting Ukraine over those fears of an expanding conflict. Several bits of manufacturing and shipping infrastructure in Russia were damaged or destroyed by Ukrainian missiles and drones in 2023, which were, again, often denied, though a bit more overt than their earlier efforts, and military and civilian buildings in Russian towns along their shared borders were damaged by drones and saboteurs from the beginning of the invasion, sometimes seemingly accidentally, but sometimes very purposefully. Artillery shelling has also incidentally or accidentally hit civilian targets across these borders, though almost all of these attacks, up until 2024, caused very little damage and few deaths or injuries. They were more symbolically than practically important. Beginning in early 2024, though, mostly drone attacks on Russian energy infrastructure seemed to impact Russia's economy. Several important oil and gas terminals being damaged to the point that they required a lot of time and investment just to get them operational again, not to mention the further investment that would be required to protect these many small and important weak points that Ukraine had shown a new willingness to attack. There were also a few drone attacks on major cities like St. Petersburg, but these seemed to be mostly symbolic strikes and were generally not claimed by Ukraine. They could have been false flag attacks launched by Russia against its own people, or launched by Ukraine's anti-Russian government allies, who are themselves Russian and operating within Russia's borders. They could also be attacks by ISIS or similar terrorist organizations, but whoever launched them, they seem to have caused more fear and consternation than actual physical damage, and that also seemed to have been the purpose of them, as they didn't really seem to have any targets beyond hitting something within that general area within these cities. And that makes sense because causing fear is important within this conflict, because as far as many Russian civilians have understood for years now, the war's been going just fine, or fine enough for them, and they haven't felt they've had much to worry about, because although a lot of their people have been drafted and sent to the front lines, the conflict itself has not really hit them beyond some brands having disappeared from shelves due to international sanctions, and a general sense that the government has clamped down on several freedoms that they previously enjoyed, using the invasion as justification. That's part of what makes a recent move by Ukraine's military so interesting. On August 6th of this year, 2024, the Ukrainian military launched an attack across their border with Russia into the Kursk Oblast, which is an administrative district of about 1 million people located in western Russia. This assault included at least 1,000 Ukrainian troops, alongside armored personnel carriers and tanks, and they plowed more than 6 miles into Russian territory within 2 days, apparently wiping out local defensive positions without too much trouble, because they drove right past many of their defensive emplacements and then came at the relatively few defenders from unexpected angles from behind rather than right in front of them, and that allowed them to rapidly capture territory and prisoners. As a result of this blitz into Kursk, more than 100,000 Russian citizens, closer to 200,000 by some estimates, have had to flee their homes. A state of emergency has been triggered in this and surrounding regions, and the Ukrainian military has captured just under 400 square miles, or around 1,000 square kilometers, of Russian territory, which is about what Russian forces have managed to capture in Ukraine over the whole of the past year. Within that held territory, they also captured 82 towns and villages, and they've captured an estimated 2,000 or so prisoners. This rapid assault into Russian territory was completely unexpected, catching even Ukraine's allies by surprise, and it struck an area that was apparently underdefended, which is part of why they were able to break through so easily. Hundreds of Russian soldiers surrendering almost immediately, none of them having expected anything like this, so far from what has become the front lines of the conflict, all the way on the other side of Ukraine. In the weeks since this assault was launched, Ukrainian forces have taken out a couple of important bridges, which serves the double purpose of making a counterattack by Russian forces more difficult, while also hobbling some of their supply lines that are fueling the Russian invasion of Ukraine further south and east. The Ukrainian force that invaded Russia is relatively small, but because of the nature of this sort of incursion, it's estimated that Russia will need something like 3 to 5 times as many soldiers as Ukraine has, minimum, if they want to successfully dislodge them, which will likely mean having to pull troops and military hardware from the front lines or other spots along their border, which would leave those other spots less defended in order to muster the proper counterattack. This spot is also reportedly somewhat protected from existing Russian artillery installations, and any attacks the Russians launch against the occupying Ukrainian forces will be attacks against their own cities and towns, something that is arguably inevitable when you are invaded and trying to boot out the invaders, but it's also not something that's super politically popular, because again, as many as a few 100,000 people have fled their homes, and if their own government bombs their homes and other infrastructure, their water, their electricity, things like that, into smithereens in order to recapture it, that probably won't make all those people too happy, and it will also make them an additional burden on the government and its resources, because they will suddenly need more support just to stay fed, to be housed, to have healthcare, things like that. This is also tricky for Russia because, as I just mentioned, pulling troops from elsewhere will require weakening either some of their border area or their front lines in eastern Ukraine, meaning they could open themselves up to another incursion, or they could slow the progress that they are making with their invasion. And that component of the conflict is currently going pretty well for them, so it's a tough sell, the idea of slowing their momentum in order to take back territory they did not think was under any real threat up until just now. Of course, this assault also makes clear that other parts of Russia's extensive shared border with Ukraine could also be under threat if the Russian military leaves any gaps or weak spots, which will likely mean having to shuffle things around a bit either way. Attacking and capturing this part of Kursk, then, would seem to be a means of forcing Russia into a two-front conflict, while also demonstrating parts of their territory that they thought were well fortified enough possibly are not, which could further distract Russia's leaders and spread their forces thinner out over a wider area. The political aspect of this might prove to be important too, as while Russia's economy has been doing pretty well considering all the sanctions, because the government has been flooding the economy with wartime investment and dropping all kinds of regulations in order to keep businesses afloat and flourishing. Despite that, authoritarian regimes are often bulwarked by certainty and the projection of invincible strength, and anything that seems to weaken that supposed inevitability and perception of invulnerability can lead to cracks in the facade that could someday lead to the people up top no longer being up top. That doesn't seem to be a major threat here, at least not at the moment, but if we are looking at the long term, this could be one more dent in what is meant to be an impervious, pristine visage of power, which could then, over time, lead to something more substantial in terms of who is in charge in Russia. All that said, Most analysts seem to think this invasion of Kursk won't be maintainable by Ukraine because it stretches their supply lines in such a way that those who did the invading can be relatively easily cut off from the rest of their military, and because it forces Ukraine into a two-front conflict as well. And while Russia can muddle through something like that at great cost, and even if it would prefer not to, Ukraine will struggle to do the same because of the nature of their population and infrastructure at the moment, both of them already being stretched pretty thin. Ukrainian forces are also already struggling on their eastern front, losing territory in small bits and pieces, but continuously, to Russian forces, and the grinding nature of that invasion has really taken a toll on those who have been fighting without a break for, in some cases, years at this point. This successful and surprising move does seem to have served as a morale boost for Ukrainian troops and citizens, though, as this is the first time a rival military has taken and held Russian territory since World War II, marking a huge symbolic victory, and one that may keep Ukraine's allies optimistic as well, which is important as many politicians in those allied countries have shown themselves to be more than willing to stop the ready flow of money and weapons into Ukraine anytime it seems like the conflict might not be going their way, even momentarily. Some reports have suggested that the assault might be part of a larger effort by Ukraine's leadership to prepare itself for what seems to be, to some at least, inevitable near-future peace talks, as holding this chunk of Russian land and all these prisoners would give Ukraine more leverage to get some of their land and prisoners back in such negotiations. Others have suggested the key purpose might be to humiliate Russian President Putin, while also making everyday Russians feel the war in the way everyday Ukrainians have, as that can help tip public opinion enough to eventually sway governmental action, even within authoritarian states like Russia. If that's the case, Ukraine may well achieve the opposite, as while Putin has seemingly been slow to respond, focusing his public statements on the Russian military's continuing success in eastern Ukraine, he is reportedly behind the scenes plotting revenge and telling his people not to engage in reported backroom negotiations focused on agreements related to not targeting energy infrastructure on either side. That's all pretty speculative, and there are a lot of anonymous sources on that aspect of this narrative, so take it with a grain of salt, but there's a chance that Putin is playing down how bad this is for him and his forces in public, but is planning some kind of significant and devastating counterattack for some time in the near future in order to deter future attacks of this kind on Russian soil. So it would be pretty horrible in order to make people think twice about doing anything like this ever again. Russian officials have described this attack as an escalation, which is exactly the language you would use if you were preparing your own escalation. So we might have that to watch out for in the coming weeks as well. Simultaneous to all this, though, Russia is on the brink of capturing all of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, which it illegally annexed a little while back, but which Ukraine has partially held all this time. So we may see some kind of change to the conflict once that capture is completed, as it could prove to be a suitable moment strategically for Russia to walk back to the peace tables, happy to take the land that it says it owns and which it will then hold, before stepping back from active conflict and arming itself for some later, potentially asymmetric, potentially also direct effort to claim the rest of the country. Another little green man attack or another wholesale invasion. There's a chance that this attack will force Putin to make politically expedient but militarily non-ideal decisions over the next few months, though. It would arguably be smartest for the Russian military to keep at it in the east, claiming what they need to claim, and then reinforcing their holdings there before going and addressing the relatively small incursion of Ukrainians in Kursk. But he may feel pressured to send forces to Kursk sooner rather than later, because of embarrassment, if nothing else, but also possibly pressure from other Russian leaders, which would spread out his forces and the military's attention, while also slowing their advances in the east, which could in turn give Ukraine a chance to shore up some of their positions, and possibly even launch more small attacks into Russian territory, taking advantage of that lessened activity in the east and the forces being spread thin, and that would further complexify the state of play and the number of emergencies the Russian military would need to address simultaneously. Each of these attacks could be small and strategic, causing outsized damage and requiring an outsized response force. A bit like how irregular militaries like Hamas and Hezbollah use cheap rockets that they know will almost always be knocked out of the sky by countermeasures, but those rockets cost maybe tens of thousands of dollars, while the countermeasures cost 10 or 20 times that. Over time, you can deplete even a superior enemy's reserves of money and hardware and people by forcing them to commit a lot more than you do every time you launch an attack. In this way, the outgunned and outpopulated Ukrainian military could tie up a lot of Russia's forces by making them worry about maintaining the bare-bones status quo back home and forcing them to overcommit, to commit a lot more resources to every single one of these incursions compared to what Ukraine commits to the attack. There's a very, very small chance that nukes could come into play here, or the threat of nukes, because in this case it could be argued Ukraine has in fact menaced the fatherland by taking Russian territory. It seems pretty unlikely that he would use even a tactical nuke on Russian territory, even to make a point, and it seems unlikely that he would open that door by launching such a weapon at Ukrainian territory. But that is something that must always be worked into the math in this kind of conflict, and especially if Putin ever feels that his leadership, his position at the top of the power pyramid in Russia is ever threatened, that could become more thinkable. So it seems very unlikely at this point, but as things escalate, that is also something to be watching for here. There's also a chance, though, that Russia will play the long game and ignore opinion polls and protests by people who are forced to flee their homes and wait to address these asymmetric incursions until later, at which point they would be in a much stronger position within Ukraine, and that would leave them in a good spot to keep pushing forward militarily or to have peace talks that heavily favor them, even more so than such talks would today. The book I'd like to recommend today is called The Disappearance of Rituals, A Topology of the Present by Byung-Chul Han. This book is a little bit difficult to describe. The author is a philosopher and cultural theorist who has written all kinds of short books on thinky topics, which is what this is as well. It's quite a short book. You could pretty easily read it all in one sitting if you wanted to, though the concepts will probably occupy your mind a good deal beyond the raw reading time. But this particular writing is about rituals, the role they have historically played in human society and civilization, and some of the issues that we are facing in an age in which our rituals are changing or in some cases disappearing entirely. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of The Disappearance of Rituals by Byung-Chul Han. You can subscribe to receive email updates, find show notes, and other such content, and support this show financially, receiving additional bonus episodes as a thank you at letsknowthings.com. Learn more about me and my work at Colin.io. Subscribe to my other news-focused podcast, One Sentence News, wherever you get your pods, or at onesentencenews.com. And say howdy on social media. I'm at Colin is my name on Instagram and Twitter, and Colin Wright on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.